A big thank you to the AIC for having me here today and for all of you for listening to my presentation. A few other quick thanks. The survey data that I'm going to be talking a bit about today is very much a team effort. I want to thank one of my colleagues, Professor David Bright, who will be speaking to you tomorrow about illicit firearms. Also Dr. Edward Jegasothi from the University of Sydney School of Public Health, and two colleagues at ANU, Professor Dr. Francis Markham and Dr. Marcus Hahn as well. Also, another quick disclaimer, very grateful to Alex and the team at iTech for funding this research, but also making it very clear that both the data and particularly the views that I'm presenting today do not reflect the official views of iTech. And one last one, after listening to Shanil's very fantastic talk there, I've got quite different views on the efficacy of taxation, its impact on organised crime. Excellent question. I think you asked about profit margin. I think that's a key sort of issue here, but I want to make very clear I'm not one of the people she's talking about that was reported on The Guardian. I've never accepted any funding from the tobacco industry or intend to do so in the future. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into the survey and then, with the time we have left, discuss a little bit about policy and implications. So, one of the reasons that we conducted this study was the Australian Tax Office, unfortunately just after the excellent AIC publication on the cost of transnational and serious crimes had already just been published, the ATO announced that their 1 in 5 estimates of illicit purchasing was a significant underestimate, and that those estimates should no longer be considered reliable. As the iTech report has made clear, and as our study also showed, a majority of the tobacco now sold in this country is illicit. So without preempting my findings too much, we did a survey of 4,000 past month nicotine consumers in March 2025, so this data is a year old. There has been significant change in the illicit market. I suspect it has grown, but also there are significant enforcement actions going on as well, so it'll be very interesting to see what future research like this does on a state-by-state basis to see whether those things have been effective or not. Now, we sidestep some of the problems that are inherent in, say, like the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, where they ask questions about whether people purchase illicit products or whether they're purchasing products that might have branding on them. We know now that there's a very significant component of the Australian illicit tobacco market that comes in counterfeit packaging, and people might not necessarily want to declare that they're smoking illicit products, that sort of social desirability bias. So we structured our questions around behaviour, frequency of use, product type, characteristics, price and place of purchase. We determined legality basically on the basis of price. If prices per pack were less than the cheapest legal wholesale, we determined them as illicit. Similarly, if they were branded and absent health warnings. Supplier type was the main legality determinant for vapes. So if they were bought outside pharmacies, for example, if they came with flavours that are prohibited under the government's pharmacy scheme, considered illicit. Like every study, there are limitations. Potential for underreporting, so social desirability bias, not eliminated, we think minimised. Recall bias, so consumers might misremember exactly how many products they purchase or how much they pay for them, and so on. Okay, so jumping straight into the findings then. Legality of most recent purchase. So we can see here, out of the people who completed our survey, so this is in the past month, whether anyone had purchased an illicit or illegal product. We found that for manufactured cigarettes, close to 50% had purchased at least one illicit product. But those statistics were significantly higher for roll-your-own tobacco, over 60%, and much, much higher for vapes. So as Alex alluded, this was a component of the study that made it into the iTech report. 95.7% of vapes illicit, which is also consistent with the National Drug Strategy Household Survey from a couple of years ago. So yeah, very small proportion coming through the government's pharmacy vape scheme, which I think we're all identified now as is not working as intended. All right, so in terms of volumes, we've got manufactured cigarettes. We calculated around 3.5 billion illicit manufactured cigarettes smoked every year. and roll your own tobacco, over 1,000 tonnes of illicit tobacco being consumed every year as well. So even though we have a majority of the volume of tobacco and nicotine products more generally being illicit, when we look at expenditure, we see something different. And the reason that expenditure is so different is, of course, because legal products are so much more expensive. So we did do pricing analysis of the various products that we had in here, but I haven't included it just for purposes of time today. So you can see we're still spending, well, Australians are still spending much more on legal manufactured cigarettes and legal roll your own tobacco than they are on the illicit stuff. This is both good news, but I think also potentially bad news because it indicates that there's much further scope for growth of the black market if we can't reverse current trends. We see the opposite for vapes, so overwhelmingly people are buying illicit vapes, and the other category refers to all other nicotine products that aren't captured, so nicotine pouches, snus, snuff, shisha, pipe tobacco, etc. All right, when we look at expenditure by state and territory, we see here, so just to explain these bars a little bit, so New South Wales, for example, out of all of the legal tobacco sold in the country, New South Wales accounts for 30% of the legal tobacco expenditure, but it accounts for around 38% of the illicit tobacco expenditure. So we see significant concentration, unsurprisingly, in our most populous states, New South Wales, followed by Victoria, followed by Queensland. South Australia, WA, Tasmania, still robust numbers, but NT and ACT, I would take those numbers with a grain of salt because we're starting to get down to very small numbers there. Now, when we look at, so these are kind of sort of big overall pictures of the market, but the demographics, I think, of the consumers were quite interesting as well. One of the most revealing things, well actually the most revealing thing that we see in terms of demographics is very clear distinctions by age. So the younger a customer was, or the younger a consumer was, much more likely to consume illicit products. But even then, while we see overwhelmingly people in the younger age brackets, 18 to 24, 25 to 34, consuming illicit products, you actually need to get to quite elderly age cohort. Well, not quite elderly, no offense to anyone in the room. You need to get up there a little bit to the 65 to 74 range before you start to see a majority of consumers that are purchasing legal products, and still very significant minorities, even in the oldest age groups consuming illicit products. Okay, so other interesting things that we saw in terms of demographics. So we did classify respondents by CIFA, Index of Socioeconomic Disadvantage. So these are particular postcodes that are associated with disadvantaged, so basically rich suburbs or poorer suburbs. And this actually really surprised us, and that is we don't tend to see actually concentration of consumption occurring in disadvantaged areas. This is kind of a common sense, but actually not reflected understanding that poorer people will preference these products more, but that is not reflected what we see here. We actually see very significant, well, basically no difference in consumption, even in the least disadvantaged quintiles compared to the most disadvantaged. We can reproduce this in another way where we asked respondents about household income as well. So we can see here very similar. So less than $20,000 per year, close to 80% purchasing of illicit tobacco. But then if we look at $200,000 or more, you can still over 70% of consumers purchasing illicit tobacco. So this is, I think, quite an interesting finding for us. This has always been one of the common sense understandings that has been built into Australian tobacco or nicotine policy, and that is less advantaged people, more disadvantaged Australians will be more price sensitive. That is actually not shown to be the case. If we look at smoking rates, smoking data, it is wealthier Australians who have been quitting in greater numbers. And if any impact of the tobacco taxes is being felt, it's being felt at those more advantaged rather than least advantaged ends. So a bit of a counterintuitive understanding that we're seeing there. All right, now we did also ask place of purchase, similar to chenille, and we found similar kinds of results there. So unsurprisingly, the tobacconist gift shops that we're seeing all around the place overwhelmingly dominated when it came to illicit manufactured cigarettes. We saw basically similar results for roll your own tobacco, which I haven't included a slide for that. Interesting things to take out here: the tobacconist gift shop, the convenience store, major supermarket chains. Now this, we reflected after we ran the survey for the first time, could be a little bit problematic because we don't think survey respondents were differentiating between the big two, or now Aldi's creeping in as well, and franchise stores like IGAs, which we think, we don't have any evidence that Coles or Woolies are doing under-the-counter cheap smokes, but we think those IGA sort of franchise stores more likely to do so, not making any specific allegations. But if we're going to do any follow-up to the survey, we'll make clear that we're going to be talking about Coles and Woolies versus other kinds of major retail outlets. Petrol stations were interesting as well here. I have heard anecdotally of people buying illicit tobacco from 7-Elevens, which was somewhat surprising, but again sort of fits into that franchise model being more vulnerable to infiltration than the big corporations. Independent sellers, as Chenille identified, this is a really interesting one, and I think will be the one to watch if, and I think it's a big if, enforcement operations can be ramped up in a long-term, sustained kind of way to suppress overt illicit retailing. What happens to that? Whether we simply see a displacement of demand into the independent sellers, man in a van, basically the same person you'd buy cannabis or methamphetamine or whatever from. Okay. So illicit vapes, we see a similar kind of story, but the independent sellers are much higher. And I think what we're seeing there is what happens when you do get a market that is more and more explicitly illicit. So the government's pharmacy scheme for vaping products was supposed to provide an off-ramp for people to smoke to the substantially less harmful vaping option. Out of a population nationwide of around 1.5 million people who vape, the pharmacy scheme is dispensing something like 5,000 to 8,000 vapes nationally a month. So they're selling vapes that people who vape don't like, in flavours they don't like. Adults do prefer sort of fruit and dessert flavours as well. It's not just targeted towards kids. So that's something to keep in mind there. Also, one of the other things as well, and Chenille mentioned this in the presentation, or one of the questions, online. So we see much more significant trading of vapes online. And again, I think this would be something to watch if we do see sustained enforcement effects that are capable of suppressing the illicit market. All right, now zooming out a little bit, overall expenditure. So I want to talk about this again. So illicit nicotine products now, according to our survey estimates, and similarly in the iTech report, although ours are slightly higher, but within the same sort of range, around $7.7 billion expenditure annually. So to put that in context, illicit nicotine, according to our research, now constitutes roughly 40% of Australia's entire illicit drug economy and is worth more than cannabis, cocaine, heroin and ecstasy combined. That is obviously bad news for law enforcement, community safety, all the rest of it, and a tremendous gift to organised crime. It also represents, I think in a policy sense, a massive new front in the war on drugs. And if you know anything about the stats that surround illicit drug enforcement, the effectiveness of supply reduction, over the last 15 or so years, we've tripled our drug law enforcement budget from around $1.2 billion to around $3.5 billion. That massive investment was intended to make drugs harder to get and to make sure that those drugs that did hit the market, that they would be more expensive and less pure. Law enforcement agencies have been doing their best with that money, year on year producing record arrests and record volumes of seizures. But when you actually look at the impact on the market, it has been negligible. There's been no change in the availability of any of the major illicit drug types. Purity has generally increased and prices have declined substantially. If you take methamphetamine, for example, it is just as available as it was 15 years ago, more pure and roughly half the price once you adjust for inflation. So this is what I would caution against, employing a supply reduction oriented model to tackle what is the third most popular recreational drug in the country after caffeine and alcohol, nicotine, used widely and routinely by millions of Australians. So, implications. Of course, we've seen this massive expansion of organised crime. $7 billion is a lot of money to inject into the criminal economy. And we've seen a widely predicted and expected increase in systemic violence. I think it's self-evident that the tax increases have driven this change. Black markets form under relatively stable and predictable conditions. In fact, we predicted exactly this would happen 8 years ago. And it's fair to say our warnings went unheeded. I think largely because they were similar to what the tobacco industry was saying. So, you sort of get tarred by, well, not association, but by coming to a similar conclusion. Obviously, we've seen a very significant collapse in tobacco excise revenue, $7.5 billion in the last financial year. There have been some rather heroic assumptions by Treasury that you're going to see an uptick there. I don't think we're going to see, those estimates haven't proved accurate in the past. Increased costs for legitimate businesses, so I'm not just talking about legitimate retailers of tobacco products here, who are of course losing massive market share to the black market. I'm talking about any business that is located anywhere near a store that sells either legal or illicit tobacco products, particularly in the form of insurance. So it's getting harder and harder for shops in those strips to get insurance. Increased risk to biosecurity. So there was another interesting article in The Conversation last week about the introduction of pests that pose serious biosecurity hazards to Australia as a result of the thousands of tonnes of illicit tobacco coming through. Increased expenditure on enforcement, so we've seen around $350 million to date. I doubt that will be sufficient to tackle a black market $7 billion in size, but I guess we'll have to wait and see around that. But I think critically here, particularly for the law enforcement in the room, this places a huge burden on law enforcement agencies. And just because there might be additional money coming from the federal government doesn't magically make more police recruits appear. And we know that there are a number of police agencies around the country that are struggling with recruitment and retention as it is. So that burden is really important. We need to think about the opportunity costs that are associated with these enforcement actions. All right, another one that I want to talk about and I think is really underexplored is the corruption of trusted insiders. So the ACIC head, Heather Cook, who spoke with us this morning, has warned that this is already happening in the private sector and the corruption in the logistics chain, so presumably ports, transportation, is facilitating the trade in illicit tobacco and nicotine products more broadly. I think there is a very serious risk to public agencies, so both law enforcement and health departments associated with this. Large-scale, very profitable illicit markets have an inevitably corrupting effect on law enforcement and regulatory agencies, but I think nicotine particularly so. One, because it is so vast, so profitable, but also I think the relative social acceptability of cigarettes. These are legal products. It is different from trading in methamphetamine or child exploitation material, in terms of the sort of social and moral consensus around these products. It's a cash job, and if you've ever hired any tradies, you know the popularity of cash jobs amongst average everyday Australians. I think the risks are particularly acute for civilian agencies, and this is something I'm very concerned about. Having health departments, even local councils getting involved in regulatory action, raiding stores that are operated by organised crime. Law enforcement agencies have safeguards built into this, and the more that law enforcement agency has to do with serious organised crime, so organisations like the ACIC, have very, very serious internal security procedures, integrity checks to guard against this. I'm not aware of health departments or local councils having any such integrity or oversight mechanisms to guard against corruption. So I think those people would be very vulnerable walking into a store run by organised crime groups with not only a lot of cash, but very well demonstrated capacities for sometimes lethal violence. We're getting threats to national security, including at least one terror attack that the AFP have linked with Kaz Hamid, allegedly linked to Kaz Hamid, the firebombing of a Melbourne synagogue last year. So the scale of this threat, the size of the illicit markets and the size and sophistication of the organised crime groups have been drawn like moths to a flame. yeah, we're starting to see national security threats come out of this as well. And lastly, we're seeing increased smoking. There's early evidence that Australia is witnessing its first increase in smoking prevalence since the 1990s, which I think is a massive public health own goal and something that no other comparable country has witnessed in recent years. All right, so key considerations, where to go from here. I think it's important to keep in mind that large-scale illicit markets are very rarely suppressed through enforcement alone. There are a few examples in history where we can point to that this has happened. One example that it made it into the news today and has been reported in recent research talked about the Australian heroin drought, where it does look like the evidence suggests that sustained law enforcement operation did significantly increase the street price of heroin and decrease the purity of heroin, and that produced good social benefits. One of the big problems with this, though, is it wasn't a large market. So past 12 months heroin use at the peak of the heroin epidemic, looking at around 30,000 users, there are over 3 million Australian consumers of nicotine products, a majority of whom now source from the illicit market. So tackling a black market of that size, sophistication, the density and complexity of the distribution networks is a much more difficult challenge, and one that I think there's good criminological reasons to question whether it will be successful or not. Now, a sufficiently large and sustained enforcement operation may, again, emphasis on the may, prompt a shift to a closed market, right? It's not going to address the underlying demand. There will still be supply getting into the country, but maybe we can shut the shop fronts that are selling it in an overt, kind of flagrant manner. There are a few key questions here. How much would that cost? That is still an open question. We don't know. Seizures, governments love talking about seizures. Seizures don't actually mean anything, right? We don't actually see, because the replacement costs are so low, organised crime groups factor these seizures into their bottom line, and they're still highly profitable. So we need to figure out how much this costs, how much it's diverting our law enforcement and our health departments as well, right, that are not engaging in the core work associated with health departments to try and pursue this goal. If it is successful, big if, how much would this reduce or simply displace demand? Would it push demand into those closed interpersonal networks that are largely beyond the capacity of police to do anything about? A few other things to keep in mind. Enforcement is much more likely to succeed in illicit markets if we can shrink the size of the illicit market. So there's a few ways that we could divert consumers back to the legal market, and here's where Shanil and I would have different views on this. Of course, there will be some consumers who are not prepared to pay a cent more for illicit or legal tobacco, but there will be some who will, right? Particularly if we can increase the search costs associated with illicit tobacco. So if we're serious about tackling this problem, I think there's no point putting, the fire hose of law enforcement while you're also putting the gasoline hose on the same sort of direction. We want to suck demand out of the legal market and divert it into the consumer market. I get that this is a controversial position. Not all of us are aligned with the tobacco industry, but I think it's something that governments need to seriously consider. Second, perhaps a less controversial a policy option, and I think one Shanil would agree with as well, is we need to seriously look at our less harmful nicotine policies, particularly around vapes. If you go to New Zealand or the United Kingdom and you're a smoker and you want to quit smoking, you can get a free vape, taxpayer funded, delivered to your door. Here we make vapes harder to get than cigarettes, which just doesn't make any sense from either criminological perspective or I would argue a health perspective as well. So again, we know that around $1.6 billion is going into illicit vapes. If we can take that out of the black market, put it back into a legal regulated system, then we're achieving both public health and criminal justice, criminology goals as well. Right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention and happy to field questions. Thanks.